The Vietnam War began as a mission to stop communism and bring freedom. But instead of liberation, it tore families apart for decades. Women who stood beside soldiers paid the heaviest price. Their sacrifice turned into a death sentence. And what they endured in those final moments remains a story almost too dark to hear.
The story begins right after World War II ended. In September 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood in Hanoi and declared that Vietnam was now an independent country. For many Vietnamese, it was a moment of hope after decades of French colonial rule. But that hope did not last long. The French wanted Vietnam back, and by the end of 1946, fighting broke out. This was the start of the First Indochina War, a brutal struggle that lasted until 1954. During this time, the Viet Minh, which was the communist-led independence movement, built its strength in the countryside. The men went into the jungles and mountains to fight, while the women were left with hard choices. Some stayed behind in their villages, farming and protecting the children. Others married Viet Minh leaders and lived lives full of danger, because being tied to a fighter meant living under constant threat from the French military and local collaborators. Some of these women, like Nguyen Thi Binh, would later become known to the world. She was not just a wife, but also a determined political activist who believed deeply in independence. Others were far less visible. Many were young village girls who married men already committed to the Viet Minh cause. These women often had to move from one place to another, hiding in safe houses or following their husbands into remote areas. Life was harsh. There was little food, constant fear of air raids, and the risk of capture at any time. The war dragged on for years. By 1950, with support from China and the Soviet Union, the Viet Minh gained more weapons and training. This made the French even more determined to crush them. Villages suspected of helping the Viet Minh were burned. Families of fighters, especially the wives, were often interrogated, beaten, or forced to work for the French as punishment. Still, many of these women remained loyal because abandoning their husbands meant betraying the independence struggle. Then came May 1954. At Dien Bien Phu, in the northwest of Vietnam, the French built a huge base. But the Viet Minh surrounded it, and after a long and bloody siege, forced the French to surrender. This was one of the biggest defeats in French colonial history. Soon after, at the Geneva Conference in July 1954, Vietnam was officially divided into two. The north was given to the communists under Ho Chi Minh, while the south came under a separate government backed by the United States. This division tore families apart. Many wives of Viet Minh leaders remained in the north, where they were somewhat safer under the new communist government. But other leaders went south to secretly organize guerrilla units that would later be known as the Viet Cong. Their wives had to decide whether to stay in the relative safety of the north or follow their husbands into dangerous southern provinces where they would be hunted. The south was under the control of President Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem ruled with an iron fist. He did not tolerate any opposition, and anyone suspected of having ties to communists was treated as an enemy of the state. His government launched what was called the Denounce Communists campaign. In villages across the south, people were pressured to point out neighbors who might have helped the Viet Minh. This often led to false accusations, and entire families could be destroyed over suspicion alone. During these years, thousands of men believed to be communist sympathizers were rounded up. Many were jailed without trial. Others were executed, and many simply vanished, leaving their families to wonder what had happened to them. Wives of Viet Minh cadre suddenly became both targets and tools in this war. Their husbands went underground, hiding in swamps, thick jungles, and tunnel systems that stretched for miles. Life in these hiding places was dangerous and exhausting, and their wives were pulled into it as well. Women like Tran Thi Yen in the Mekong Delta became more than just partners at home. They acted as messengers, carrying secret notes from village to village under the cover of everyday chores. Some smuggled food, clothing, and medical supplies to fighters hiding in remote areas. Others helped recruit new members by quietly talking to neighbors and encouraging them to join the cause. They risked everything each time they left their homes because Diem's security forces were everywhere. Diem's secret police, known for their cruelty, had one main goal, which was to destroy the underground networks before they could grow stronger. Wives of suspected leaders were considered easy targets. If they were captured, they were beaten and threatened until they gave up information. Some women were tied up and paraded through their own villages, so others could see the price of helping the Viet Cong. This was meant to spread fear, but instead, it often deepened anger among the local people. By the end of the 1950s, international observers, such as the International Control Commission, which was set up to oversee the Geneva Accords, reported troubling patterns. Hundreds of women, many of them wives of Viet Cong cadre, were being detained without trials. They were kept in overcrowded prisons or military outposts with no legal process. Some never returned. For those women, loyalty to their husbands and to the idea of a free Vietnam meant living under constant threat of torture, humiliation, or death. But even with the fear, many did not break. They believed that the struggle was bigger than themselves, and that one day their sacrifices would bring victory. But the early 1960s brought a new and much heavier burden for them. The United States began sending more advisors, weapons, and money to South Vietnam. Their goal was to wipe out the communist underground before it could take full control of the countryside. This meant that not only fighters, but also their families, were placed under a much brighter spotlight. Villages suspected of sheltering Viet Cong were often raided by the South Vietnamese army, sometimes with American helicopters overhead. Homes were burned to the ground. Crops were destroyed so that food would not reach the guerrillas. For wives, this was devastating. They had to move from place to place, carrying their children on their backs, often with no chance to rest. Some women gave birth while hiding in the jungle, without doctors or midwives, and had to keep their babies silent to avoid detection. In 1962, the South Vietnamese government introduced the Strategic Hamlet Program under the advice of the Americans. Villagers were forced to leave their ancestral homes and were relocated into fortified compounds surrounded by fences. This was meant to cut off support for the Viet Cong, but it also made life worse for the wives. Families were torn apart. Many husbands were outside the hamlets still fighting in the jungles, while their wives and children were locked inside, constantly monitored. For some, this separation lasted for years. Others tried to escape and were caught, beaten, or even shot. The situation grew even more unstable in 1963 when President Ngo Dinh Diem was overthrown and killed. Instead of bringing peace, his fall only opened the door to more chaos. Different generals fought for power in Saigon, and the countryside paid the price. The war became more brutal. Entire families of suspected Viet Cong leaders were now considered guilty by association. Soldiers stormed homes in the middle of the night, dragging women out and demanding to know where their husbands were hiding. Some were sent to prison camps, while others were executed on the spot as examples. For the wives, there was no safe place. They had to learn to live like fugitives, never sleeping in the same house 2 nights in a row. Some dug hiding holes under kitchens or animal pens. Others disguised themselves as simple farmers or traders, carrying baskets of vegetables that hid secret notes or weapons inside. Every errand carried the risk of being stopped and searched. By March 1965, the United States made a major move. U.S. Marines landed in Da Nang, marking the start of large-scale American combat operations. This was a turning point. The war was no longer a distant struggle fought in hidden corners of the country. It became an all-out conflict with massive bombings, search and destroy missions, and helicopter assaults. For the wives, this meant danger was everywhere. At this stage, survival itself became their battle. It was no longer only about helping their husbands or protecting the movement. These women were now fighting to keep themselves and their children alive in a war that seemed to swallow everything in its path. Then came January 1968, the Tet Offensive. It was one of the biggest turning points of the Vietnam War. During the Vietnamese New Year holiday, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops attacked cities and towns all across the country. Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, and many provincial capitals suddenly became battlefields. For a few days, the world saw that the Viet Cong were far stronger than anyone had believed. But for the wives of these leaders, Tet brought unimaginable suffering. In Hue, the old imperial capital, the fighting raged for almost a month. Streets were bombed, homes collapsed, and families were trapped in the crossfire. South Vietnamese and American forces swept through neighborhoods looking for Viet Cong fighters. But they also targeted civilians they believed were connected to the rebels. Wives of cadre were pulled from their homes, accused of aiding their husbands. Some were dragged into the streets, beaten, and killed. Others were executed in secret. Reports from Hue later revealed horrifying scenes. Hundreds of civilians were buried in mass graves. Among them were women linked to local commanders. Names like Lê Thi Na appeared in records. She was accused of helping her husband, a Viet Cong officer who had fought in the city. Witnesses recalled that she was taken by soldiers, terrified, and never seen alive again. Her body was found later among those executed without trial. These killings were not limited to Hue. Across South Vietnam, sweeps took place in the aftermath of Tet. Families of Viet Cong leaders were hunted down. Children were separated from their mothers. Some women were sent to prisons that were already overcrowded, while others were executed in their villages as warnings. For many wives, Tet was the turning point. Once hidden in shadows, they were now targets marked for death. By the end of the 1960s, the Vietnam War had already swallowed up millions of lives. The fighting was fierce in the jungles and villages. But another war was being fought behind prison walls. This was the world of the torture chambers, where the wives of Viet Cong leaders often spent their final days. Prisons such as Con Son Island and Chi Hua in Saigon became notorious. Con Son, located off the southern coast, was especially feared. It was run by the South Vietnamese authorities with American support. Prisoners were locked in what became known as tiger cages. These were small concrete cells, barely large enough to lie down in, covered with iron bars. Prisoners inside could not stand fully upright. They were exposed to sun, rain, and rats. For the wives of Viet Cong leaders, this was not just a prison. It was a slow death sentence. Inside these cells, women were kept in chains for weeks or months at a time. Food was scarce. Many became sick with malaria, dysentery, or infections. But medical care was almost never provided. Guards often used starvation and beatings as tools to break them. Some women were dragged out for interrogation, forced to reveal information about their husbands or other guerrillas. The torture could last hours. Yet many endured in silence, refusing to betray their families or the cause. Nguyen Thi Dinh later spoke about the fate of many women she had known. While she herself was not imprisoned during these years, she lost countless comrades who were wives of local leaders. They were not fighters on the battlefield, but they were treated as dangerous enemies. Reports from 1970 revealed just how widespread this suffering was. More than 30% of the women held in South Vietnamese prisons were wives or relatives of Viet Cong fighters. This meant thousands of women, many of whom had never carried a gun, were locked away simply because of who they were married to or related to. Most never saw a courtroom. They had no trials, no lawyers, and no hope of release. Their guilt was assumed the moment their connection to a Viet Cong leader was known. Their last days were spent in misery. Darkness surrounded them in underground cells. Chains cut into their wrists and ankles. The smell of disease filled the air. Some died slowly from untreated illnesses. Others were beaten to death by guards during interrogations. And when they died, their bodies were often buried in unmarked graves, leaving families with no way of knowing what had happened to them. The torture was meant to break their husbands, but it rarely worked. Instead, it left deep scars and endless grief. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. On paper, the agreement promised an end to fighting and a chance for peace in Vietnam. But in reality, the war did not stop. Small battles continued almost every day, especially in the countryside. South Vietnamese forces still searched for Viet Cong fighters, and families connected to them remained under suspicion. For many wives, the years after 1973 were some of the hardest. Their husbands were often hiding deep in the jungles, cut off from regular supplies. That left wives as the only bridge, secretly carrying food, medicine, and information. They became the last link, keeping many commanders alive. The South Vietnamese government, weak but desperate, targeted these women heavily. In rural provinces, sweeps through villages were common. If a wife was suspected of helping her husband, she could be arrested on the spot. Some were locked away in small district prisons, while others simply disappeared without a record. The fear of betrayal hung over every home. Villagers who were loyal to the government sometimes reported their neighbors in exchange for money or safety. This meant that even within their own communities, wives of Viet Cong leaders could never feel truly safe. By 1974, the North Vietnamese army was building strength for a final offensive. Battles raged across the Central Highlands, and South Vietnamese forces began losing ground. For women tied to the Viet Cong, the pressure grew worse. Many lived with the constant knowledge that if the South collapsed, they might be freed. But until then, every day was a risk of capture or execution. Then came April 1975. The final collapse of South Vietnam happened faster than anyone expected. North Vietnamese tanks rolled southward at incredible speed, capturing city after city. Refugees filled the roads, fleeing towards Saigon. In this chaos, prisons began to break down. Some wives of Viet Cong leaders who had been held for years were suddenly freed as guards abandoned their posts. Families were reunited after long separations, though many were broken by the suffering they had endured. But not all wives lived to see freedom. In several provinces, including Quang Nai and Quien Hoa, chaos turned into revenge. Neighbors who had suffered during the war, families who had lost sons or brothers to Viet Cong attacks, sometimes turned against the wives of leaders. They dragged them from their homes, accusing them of being responsible for the bloodshed. Public executions took place in village squares, carried out not by soldiers, but by angry mobs. Some women were beaten to death. Others were hanged or shot without any trial. For them, the war ended not with peace, but with terror in front of the very communities where they had once lived. The fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, marked the end of the Vietnam War. North Vietnamese soldiers raised their flag over the city, and the world saw the collapse of the South. But for the wives of Viet Cong leaders, the story was far more complicated. Many never lived to see this moment. The victory that others celebrated was too late for them. Those who did survive carried deep wounds. Some were physical scars from years of torture, starvation, and imprisonment. Others carried invisible pain, trauma that never left them. Testimonies collected in the years after 1975 revealed how these women had endured isolation, beatings, and constant fear. In the new communist Vietnam, some were honored as martyrs and celebrated for their sacrifice. Their names were written into history as symbols of loyalty and courage. But not every woman was remembered. Many whose husbands were lower-ranking cadre, or who had died anonymously in small prisons, simply disappeared from the records. Their families often kept silent, either out of shame or out of fear of drawing attention to painful past ties. In many cases, children grew up not knowing the full story of how their mothers had suffered or died. Silence became a way of surviving, even after the war was over. For those who were recognized, honor did not erase the pain. They had lost husbands, brothers, and children to the war. They had endured years of living under suspicion, treated as enemies by one side and as sacrifices by the other. The communist victory gave them a place in official memory, but their private grief remained.